Welcome to another episode of the Everything Antarctica podcast. Today we're talking about weather in Antarctica. So all sorts of different things that people ask us about, the temperature and winds and snowfall and things like that. So we're just going to have a brief discussion about what some of those things are, where they come from, how it all starts, and what the impact of those is on general day-to-day life. So where should we start, Johnny?
One of the misconceptions of Antarctica is that it snows an awful lot, and we've sort of touched on this before, that Antarctica is actually a desert and there's such little amount of moisture that it's classified as a desert. So despite what most people think, there's not a heck of a lot of snowfall. Most of the snow that we seem to get is blowing in from elsewhere and probably falls higher up and comes via big winds that sort of move it around. Yeah,
that's one of those misconceptions that we often get alongside, have you ever seen a polar bear? So yeah, it's just like, oh, there must be so much snow, it must snow every day and you mustn't see much blue sky at all. But in fact, it's quite the opposite. We probably get more good days than we do get days that are not good to be outside. And well, we actually do. It's probably 95% of the time is a fine day, and yeah, doesn't really snow a whole lot from the sky. A lot of the snow that we do get is wind blown from other areas of Antarctica and just kind of circulates around the continent. So yeah, that's a really good one, a good misconception to clear up. So yeah, if there's nothing else that you take from this episode, just know that it doesn't snow a whole lot in Antarctica and that it's technically classed as a desert.
That being said, there is more rain being recorded in Antarctica, which is a bit of a worry, particularly up on the peninsula and stuff like that. So it's not nearly as dry throughout the entirety of the continent as it once was. But
those very northern areas that of the peninsula that extend just south of South America, starting to record some additional rainfall up there, which is not ideal.
And the same thing can be said of lightning and thunder. So it's quite a strange sensation to go somewhere and spend a period of time there without any thunderstorms or lightning. So I quite enjoy thunderstorms and lightning, particularly when tucked up in bed. But no, you don't get those while you're down on the ice.
Yeah, and that's down to the really low humidity of the environment there. So it's a very dry environment, and it's just not conducive to producing those lightning storms and thunderstorms and things. So.
What other weather phenomena do we have or don't have down in Antarctica?
Yeah, well, I think like the wind is a pretty easy one that comes up quite a lot. So Antarctica is classed as the windiest continent on average around all of the other ones. So we do get quite a lot of wind there. It's not like that there's crazy blizzards every single day, but there is usually a pretty consistent breeze that's happening throughout the duration of the time that you're down there, and that might range from just like a gentle breeze through to a full-on blizzard. We do get them, but it's not something that we experience all the time.
And then there's katabatic winds. Do you want to maybe sort of give us a bit of an understanding around what katabatic winds are and how they work?
Yeah, so katabatic winds are essentially winds that blow down off the polar plateau, essentially down glaciers and down ice shelves and things like that. And as they accelerate off the mountain ranges and things, they accelerate, which increases the wind speeds down the bottom there.
And particularly noticeable in areas like the McMurdo Dry Valleys, which is kind of pretty close to Scott Base. This is part of the reason why the dry valleys have such low snow accumulation, because a lot of the stuff there just sublimates, and what still sticks around, a lot of that can just get blown away. So you end up having these big scouring winds that kind of come forcing down off the polar plateau. And this is also part of the reason why there's been no accurate measurement of the fastest wind speed ever recorded in Antarctica, is because the instrumentation either blows away or breaks.
Yeah, it's funny to think that you just set up this instrumentation to measure wind speeds and directions and things like that, but they're not capable of withstanding the actual degree of wind speed that blows through there. So often they just get destroyed, and yeah, there's unfortunately no accurate measure there.
Interestingly to note as well, a lot of the weather patterns, particularly of the southern hemisphere, all circulate around in a clockwise direction around the South Pole. So a lot of those winds and a lot of those weather systems actually all end up cycling around. So when you look at it from a map perspective, you can just start seeing all of these other systems all rotating around the continent in a clockwise direction around this core system that circulates around the South Pole.
Yeah, and that's one of the contributing factors to why some passages of ocean between, say, South America and the Antarctic Peninsula in that Drake Passage, why that is some of the roughest seas in the world, because it just converges between these two headlands with this wind that, again, it gets funneled through this relatively small channel in comparison to the rest of the oceans and just accelerates through there, creating some pretty gnarly ocean.
And we here in New Zealand, we often feel the effects of those southern weather fronts as well. So often, if we get a cold snap from the south, that's weather that's been sort of drawn up from Antarctica and then ends up giving us a good little bit of a cold snap. So being reasonably close to Antarctica, we feel the effects of these weather patterns that are occurring further south all too well.
Yeah, and it's really important to generate that connection between Antarctica and the rest of the world, because what happens down in Antarctica does have an impact on the rest of the world. So often you might hear people think, oh well, Antarctica's so far away, why does it matter to me? And it's, well, the weather that you're experiencing in different parts of the planet are directly generated from what happens in Antarctica, so it's all related.
It's all one big system, and if you start looking at one part of it, it interacts with another, so there's no way that you can actually say that it's a completely separate system. It's all interlinked, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. What other systems have we got in terms of weather down in Antarctica?
I suppose the next one to probably talk about is the cold temperatures. So a lot of people would, it comes as no surprise that the coldest temperature ever recorded was in Antarctica. But also in the summer times, we find that fluctuates quite a bit and can get a lot warmer than a lot of people would expect. It's not minus 40 degrees year round. It sort of fluctuates quite a bit. And also, depending on how far south you are, that will also change what your temperature kind of gets down to and what your average temperature is.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen temperatures as warm as 4 degrees at Scott Base, so that's, it's a couple of degrees above the freezing point of water, so you do get water runoff and you get melt water, and there are parts of Antarctica that even have rivers. So as that ice and the snow starts to melt in the peak of summer, you do get running water, which is something that not a lot of people think about when they associate with when they think about Antarctica.
Absolutely. After spending a winter down there, and you come to a temperature of plus 4 degrees Celsius, it feels almost tropical, and that's often when you'll see people walking around outside in t-shirt and shorts, and people just think that you're mad doing that even at that temperature, but compared to what it is that you've probably spent your winter going through, it does feel remarkably warm, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even at some of those low temperatures below zero, I remember after the winter we had a storm that came through that actually brought some reasonably warm weather with it, and it was minus 8 degrees, and I was doing a few chores and a few jobs outside just in a t-shirt and things like that, just to get my skin exposed to the weather, because you're rugged up whenever you go outside all the time, pretty much from head to toe. So sometimes it's nice just to feel the environment on your skin.
Absolutely. And then we sort of have discussed previously how throughout those winter months we'll end up having sea ice growth, so that'll end up extending quite far out. And what that actually does is that helps regulate the temperatures and the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, particularly at Scott Base. So if we end up having a sea ice breakout and all the sea ice blows out of the bay, as the sea ice is breaking out, you'll often see how far away it is based on how dark the clouds are on the horizon to the north. So interestingly, you can actually pick that, okay, the sea ice is not far away from being completely gone, purely based on the fact that the real dark storm clouds that are sit on the horizon, because you've got so much more open ocean. If you contrast that with a season where there's a lot more sea ice, or the sea ice is a lot thicker and it's not going to go and blow out, you'll often see that you'll end up having blue sky days for a lot longer. Interestingly as well, you'll also find when it does actually break out, that open ocean effect means that you do actually feel like it's a lot colder, because those winds and those breezes that you feel often will have a higher moisture component to it. So that wind chill factor does actually change as well based on the amount of moisture that's in the atmosphere. Yeah,
and you've experienced seasons where the sea ice has broken out and when the sea ice has not broken out. So what are the very key things that you associate with those different events?
Yeah, so it's all down to often storm fronts going through. So what happens every year is the because it's a seasonal thing, often they'll come through once a year and cut a channel through the sea ice for a resupply to McMurdo, and then often off the back of that there'll be a lot of the ice will just end up moving out of the bay. So it's all tidal, so you've got all this wave movement that's going on. So if you end up having particularly good strong breezes going particularly up the bay, they will help break out some of that sea ice and make it open water. Once it gets more open water, obviously you'll have more ice starting to move out, because once that ice has stopped holding other ice in, it just starts to sort of feed away relatively quickly. Interestingly, the first season that I was down there and saw a sea ice breakout, it was actually linked to a cyclone up in the Pacific Islands.
Oh, right.
That was the wave action that they attributed the final breakout was down to this event happening far away. So just going back to the point that we made before, how interconnected these systems all are.
Yeah, and then we see once that sea ice disappears, again, that connectivity to other parts of Antarctica really shines through. So that's when you start to see some of the wildlife coming further south, and often have the likes of emperor and Adelie penguins right out the front of Scott Base, which is a little bit more rare when the sea ice is there, because they have to sort of belly slide and walk their way a longer distance. But if they can just swim down there, then it makes it easier and opens up areas further south for them to find food.
Yeah, and particularly noticeable in whales, right? So we won't see necessarily many minke whales further south, although they can often traverse through if we end up having melt pools throughout the sea ice, they can go through and they can seem to stay under for a lot longer, as opposed to orca, which actually need a fairly open channel to be able to go and come south. So if that sea ice completely goes, then yeah, we'll see orca and see minke whales sort of swimming around in the bay, and as you say, plenty of penguins, which is always awesome to see.
Yeah. We touched briefly before on storms and blizzards and things like that, but that's an incredible experience when you're sitting inside the base and a storm starts blowing through. So the majority of our very high wind storms come from the south, so they're relatively easy to predict, which then means that you can prepare for it adequately. So you'll move things around to the northern side of the base so they don't get completely covered in snow, or that you'll know that if you leave something uncovered on the northern side of the base, they might end up getting covered in snow drifts that blow through, and that interaction with the base itself. But I remember one experience that I had, it was pretty much the first storm that we had throughout the start of winter, and the wind was so strong that even the micro little holes in the cladding were meaning that this super fine snow was blowing in through little gaps in the door seals and things like that, and then piling up on the inside of the station. It's such an immense force that would be able to squeeze that microfine snow through the tiniest of little cracks, and the buildings are shifting and shaking and creaking and groaning, and you feel almost like, the buildings are shifting around, and you're wondering like, oh, is this safe? And then you come back to the thought of, this has been standing for many decades, and it's withstood many storms like this. It's completely safe and has been engineered in a way that is ready to withstand these super high wind forces and things like that. So you are very safe, but it doesn't stop the noises and the creaking and the groaning as the building expands and contracts in the movement. It's quite a surreal experience.
And then you couple that also with having winter, time versus summertime. So, a storm in summer might look very different to having it when it's all pitch black and dark outside. And as you say, you're sort of down to your winter crew numbers. So it's all just a bit more sort of exciting, isn't it, than in summer, when it's kind of like, oh yeah, it'll blow through, and it doesn't usually stick around as much in summer. Whereas we do end up in winter, we'll often have prolonged periods of storms and definitely longer ones, yeah.
Yeah, and not to mention that during the winter it's 24 hours of darkness as well, so you might look outside and see if you can see something, but you won't be able to see the flagpole that's 30 metres away from you, whereas in summer, maybe you'll get the odd glimpse of the flagpole to help orientate yourself and know where you're looking. But yeah, that difference between the 24 hours of sun and the 24 hours of darkness really makes a difference as well to the whole experience. It just feels very The Thing type vibes, or 30 Days a Night type vibes, when it's it's dark outside and the buildings are creaking and groaning, and you just feel like there's some mysterious creature that's just going to be hiding outside waiting to come in. So yeah, pretty amazing experience.
I don't think there's any winters that wouldn't have gone through, and as a storm is rolling through, be watching the anemometers, the wind speed gauges, to see whether or not it gets into the record books. There's a lot of people that are just kind of like, oh, yep, is this a really good one? And you're always trying to gauge to see whether or not it actually is a, on the charts of big storms, does it register?
Yeah, and temperature-wise as well. So the record coldest temperature at Scott Base is minus 57 degrees. And in the winter of 2023, when I was south, we got to a temperature of minus 56.2. So we're a 0.8 of a degree off the record coldest temperature, and everybody was gathered around the temperature gauge to see, like,
will it drop?
Is it going to keep going? Will it get colder? Will it keep colder? And every 0.1 of a degree that it got colder, there was like cheering and everyone was super excited, and then it'd jump back up and get 0.1 of a degree warmer and everyone would be like, boo, no, go the other way. So I mean, we did get very close, and just walking out in that, obviously you're fully geared up, but for me it was something that I just wanted to experience, just to see, like, what is it actually like to be that cold. And you're not outside for very long in that temperature. But one of the things that I did do was I went out, and in the winter, when you can breathe and you can see your breath and things like that, when it's that cold, when you breathe out, you can actually hear your breath freezing and crystallizing. And it's just such a bizarre feeling to know that you're breathing out and the moisture in your breath is actually freezing that quickly that it makes a noise, and you can actually hear it cracking and groaning and things like that. But yeah, minus 56.2 degrees, coldest ambient temperature I've ever experienced, and it was unbelievably cold.
And just on that as well, when you talk about going outside in these temperatures, so we have like a condition system, so based on what the weather is doing, so that's down to like temperature, but it's also down to visibility and general wind speed. So there's usually a few criteria as to say whether or not you're allowed to kind of how far you can go and recreate. So as those weather fronts come through, you start actually becoming more and more confined to the station, but that doesn't mean that you can't just actually, particularly if you're safe with other people there watching, or in really bad situations, you might end up having a rope and a harness just so that you can actually always find your way back to the station. Often that's quite an exhilarating time to actually go out and actually spend some time experiencing these weather phenomena.
Yeah. One of the questions that I get quite often on social media is, what's the weather reporting like, and how do you get your weather reports and know what's coming up for the day? So for us at Scott Base, we've always got the ability to look at a local online weather predicting system and kind of make our own judgments on what we think the weather's going to do, but we have the benefit of having access to a meteorologist at McMurdo Station who prepares daily weather reports and sort of weekly look-aheads for periods, particularly when we're expecting flight operations, to say that, Friday looks like a good day for flying, it's going to be clear and low winds, or, maybe if there's a flight scheduled for Monday, you might want to make or start thinking about some contingency plans in case that plane doesn't actually take off and land. So having access to an expert in weather predictions who's preparing weather reports for you gives you a really streamlined way to think about how you're going to manage your day. One of the examples that I had was that we had a project that we were running, but we had some weather forecast to come in at 2 p.m. So we made the plan that we'd go out and we'd work for the morning. We'd spend a couple of hours after lunch just preparing and strapping things down to make sure that it wasn't going to blow away or be covered in snow. And then pretty much right as predicted, maybe about 2:30 in the afternoon, this front came through and you couldn't really see much more than about 10 meters in front of you. So a really good call, made for really good planning, and yeah, having access to that information just makes operations a lot easier.
Yeah, and as you say, it's key to operating an airfield, right? So when you've got these flights coming and going, they need to see what's going on. But we're pretty fortunate in the sense that there's been a lot of data collected over such a long time. So we've been operating down in Antarctica there for well over 60 years in the way that we currently are. So we've got some really good data as to say, yeah, okay, well, what are those weather cycles? What do they look like? And be able to predict that to a much better accuracy than previously. One thing to note is where you end up having those sea ice completely blows out and you end up having a lot more moisture in the atmosphere, those are the times when we end up finding that the storms and the unpredictability of the weather is increased. So in summers and towards the end of summer, where if you still have all that sea ice, you'll find that typically your winter season will be a lot more kind of subdued, and you won't necessarily you'll be able to predict with much greater accuracy whether or not when the storms are going to come and how frequent and how severe they are. If you end up having a lot more moisture, that means that you're just simply going to have a lot more unsettled weather, particularly in those shoulder seasons.
Yeah, I was lucky enough that the sea ice didn't break out last season, so it was very predictable, and within a couple of hours we could have a pretty good idea of what was going to happen.
And it makes it so much easier when you're planning things and trying to, particularly with what you were doing as far as some of that construction stuff, making sure that you had a good understanding of when to bolt things down. And
yeah. And I think we've spoken before about fam trips and some of the recreational things that we get to do. Last winter we got the opportunity to go over to the weather forecasting building at McMurdo and got a tour through how they get their data and weather and things like that. And what they do is once a day they'll launch a weather balloon to get real-time sort of information about what is happening, which will inform their weather models and lead into the process of developing that weather report for the day. So very useful, but also a really cool tour just to go and talk to the meteorologists and see how they go about their day and what they do and what that process is like. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Moving on to things that aren't necessarily directly in our sphere, but sort of geomagnetic storms, so things that actually create the aurora and things like that. That's some other weather that we don't normally sort of talk to, and even the way that some of those moon cycles and stuff like that. The moon obviously in winter when you've got a lot of snow and ice on the ground is great at illuminating the whole place, almost like it is daytime. And
that space weather is really interesting. So there's a geomagnetic experiment at Scott Base that has a data set that dates back to 1957. So that was set up as part of the development of Scott Base back when Sir Edmund Hillary and his team built the first buildings down there, and that data set has continued for well over 60 years, and that gives a really reasonably accurate prediction on when those geomagnetic storms from the sun, the space weather that's coming through, which in winter is great because we rely on that information to give us our aurora forecasts and to know when we might have any issues with communications and things like that and disruptions there. So yeah, that's also another part that we often don't talk about when we talk about weather, is the space weather component. And I think there are a few legendary scientists in New Zealand that I think we'll get on the show to talk through space weather and how that impacts the prediction of auroras and things like that, because it's an important part that doesn't really get much traction. People don't often think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so interesting when you start thinking about all these weather situations and events that we've sort of gone through today, and you look, and everything that you do in Antarctica is directly related to the weather. You can't be a part of the continent without actually understanding what's going on, and so many of the day-to-day activities are limited by what the weather's doing outside, or no limits at all. Excellent, great. You can go off and do what you need to do and get your day's work done. So you take it for granted, I suspect, back in other places around the globe where weather is not necessarily as extreme or harsh, or you don't have like a central place that you need to kind of hunker down in the event of a storm. So
yeah, one of the cool things that I love as well is that when that daily forecast comes out, it's printed out and placed in a number of areas around the station. So the very first thing that I do when I get out of bed is I walk past the notice board and I look at the weather, and I think that just becomes something that most people who go to Antarctica just naturally develop a sense of, to give them an idea of what activities they can do or can't do, or may have to make a different plan for the day. But just getting into that routine of going, all right, I'm going to check the weather, and then you start to develop a sense of if there was a storm or some wind forecast blowing in from the south that might hit at midday. At about 11:30, you're looking outside and you're going, oh, is that starting to come true? What are the things that I'm seeing? What do I need to think about? If this is delayed for an hour and I go ahead with the activity that I had planned, what might I need to think about? Maybe it's best if we delay that for a day to a time when the weather is looking like being a little bit better. So I think collectively it builds the entire knowledge and people's understanding of weather patterns and things like that, which for me translates back to New Zealand as well. Whereas I used to just go on the news and say, what's the weather? And it'll tell you, oh, it's 15 degrees today and sunny, to a little bit more in depth, like which direction is the wind coming from and what's going to happen at certain times of the day when I'm outside. Am I going to need 1 layer, 2 layers? Should I pack a rainproof jacket? Things like that. So I find that it's translated across into my day-to-day life back in New Zealand as well, because I just think about it and give it a bit more respect.
Absolutely, me too. And I find that it's so interesting when you start learning what local weather looks like for wherever you are. So you sort of, you start getting an understanding of, oh, well, we're starting to see that particular cloud at this time of day, or the wind has changed direction, and oh, yep, okay, this colour in the sky in the morning or whatever. And so you start actually understanding a bit more of actually what these processes and these systems look like, and then you can really start saying, oh, okay, actually, I've got a reasonably good idea of, what time's good to go outside, or I can see that something's coming in, so we might hunker down for the next couple of days. Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty nerdy, but it's pretty fun, especially when you get to the point where you're making your own sort of weather prediction and that comes true. Or if it doesn't come true, then you think back and you're like, all right, what might have influenced that decision, or what's changed since I looked at the weather forecast. So I mean, it's really good, especially if you're into your outdoor activities, like you go hiking and things like that, or even down to the point if you're into sea kayaking or surfing or things like that, when you're in the ocean and you're at the mercy of that, and how the weather has an impact and plays on the way that things like waves are developed and stuff like that. But yeah, just getting into the detail and getting a better understanding of how that all works and how it impacts your day-to-day life, I think is pretty rewarding. It's pretty cool to know. Yeah,
absolutely, and it keeps things in perspective that we aren't actually the centre of our universe. So, which is actually is a good place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we just adapt to the weather. We can't change the weather, but we adapt our day around what's going to happen. So, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Nice one. Oh, well, I think that probably sums up a brief foray into some of the weather that we see down in Antarctica, and hopefully that gives you a better understanding of what it is that we sort of talk about and what the things that we think about when we talk in regards to weather in Antarctica. Yeah,
and if you're interested, go and educate yourself and go and develop a better understanding of how the weather impacts your day-to-day life, which is something that we've both taken from our experiences down in Antarctica, but it doesn't mean that you have to be in Antarctica to get a better understanding of how the weather impacts your day-to-day life in the real world. So go and check it out. Hopefully that was an episode that you got something from, and yeah, go and check it out. That's it for today's episode of the Everything Antarctica podcast. Thanks for listening. If you want to find out more about us as hosts, you can find us on Instagram at Matty K. Jordan and at Johnny Harrison NZ. We're also on socials. You can find us at Everything Antarctica. This episode will be released on all streaming platforms, and the long form video will be found on YouTube. Check us out wherever you listen to your podcasts.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating. This will really help us in our mission to make this podcast as good as it possibly can be. Please share this episode with your friends and social networks so we can spread the word to more people.
Until next time, stay cool.